Hello, everybody, and welcome to our second talk, Rethink Compliance Expert Talk. Today, we're talking about supply chain compliance and ESG, environmental, social, and corporate governance. The whole subject is a big one, and it's entirely new to most of the companies, especially the smaller ones. So we wanted to deep dive a little bit today. But before we do that, I wanted to introduce you to our channel. So you can find us on YouTube or on LinkedIn with this live session. And you can also follow our blogs on our internet site, www.msg-compliance.com. And please subscribe onto the channel, leave your comments. And you have also the opportunity to leave questions during our whole live broadcasting in the comment section that you find either in YouTube or on LinkedIn. So please leave your message. It will directly brought to us into the studio, and then we can forward that to our experts. So let me firstly introduce you to Dirk Findeisen, my managing director partner in our company MSG Rethink Compliance, who will introduce us to our subject today. Hey Dirk, so what is it all today about? Please give me a quick intro.
Oh, so if you ask one side of the medal, it's all about hot new topics. It's about the German Supply Chain Act and everything new within Europe and across the world. If you ask the other side of the medal, they will say, "Oh, it's all known. It's all the normal stuff that we know from FCPA, that we know from other regulations, but also the UN Global Compact is issuing it." It's about how to manage from a compliance perspective your supply chain in a better way, in a more sustainable way, and also following on the ESG criteria that are all across the world. So that's more or less the topic. It's a little bit hype, a little bit as we do it usually, and a little bit from yesterday. So it's for everything and for everybody, something about compliance on supply chain.
That sounds great. So, and we also invited an expert today to help us a bit to put more light on this shade. And I would like to introduce to you Enrico Aresu, who's an expert on the whole subject, working for Moody's. Hi, Enrico. How are you today?
Hi, fine, thank you. And you?
Excellent, thank you. It's getting colder here in this part of the world.
Always good.
Yeah.
It's
As well
always
here.
good.
Yeah. Frankfurt is a bit cold, but it's fine. I mean,
yeah,
we are pretty much used to that.
That's clear. So I mean, Enrico, you're also one of the anti-financial crime experts and also financial crime fighters in the scene for many years. I don't think that we need to go through your whole vita, but in order to scope the whole issue a little bit, I would like to get a small intro and your perspectives, maybe your personal outlook on on the supply chain compliance and ESG for the next year or so.
Yeah, sure. Maybe just speaking about really the topics that from a compliance perspective are pretty much a challenge for our customers, for organizations on. I would say that there are a couple very interesting, like for example, increased focus on culture and compliance. This is I mean, a very important point, because prosecutors show how having in place policies and procedures is not enough, actually. No. So, for example, the anti-bribery corruption policies and procedures of a very large global company in the aerospace industry were not enough to save it from a large fine in 2020, as the company had a corporate culture which permitted bribery. This was the rationale behind the decision of prosecutors. And then obviously data is a pretty much relevant topic in compliance. So compliance teams should consider whether they use data effectively enough to inform the design, implementation, and effectiveness of compliance programs. But as you can imagine, data protection regulations can be a constraint, leveraging this data. But also looking at what the Department of Justice in US said, this aspect cannot be used as a reason for compliance failures. And this is the point, find the right trade-off between leveraging this data in compliance and being compliant with data protection regulation and so on. So it's a pretty much interesting topic. Maybe I don't know if Dirk, you want to comment in.
Sure. You know me quite good, so I'm always on the jump. So it's really, if you talk about data protection and data transparency. So what kind of data do you really need to see, at least from a data entity perspective, for compliance reasons? Is there anything specific? So if you look on your supply chain management that you need to run anyway, are there specific data requirements just for compliance?
It's a very interesting question. It depends. As you know, so in compliance we don't have just a black and white situation. What we can say is that one of the most relevant measures in compliance is the due diligence, and due diligence needs data. Okay, and the due diligence are becoming more and more sophisticated. So it means that, for example, if you look at an entity from AML perspective or anti-money laundering perspective, you need for sure data about in regard to the beneficial ownership, so the ownership structure and everything about that. If you look at for example, sanctions from OFAC, from BIS, and so on. The point is that you cannot just anymore look at sanctioned entities, because now OFAC already for 7 years, 8 years has this new sanction by extension topic, and you need additional data, to really understand if a not directly sanctioned entity may be sanctioned by extension because a stake in this entity is owned by a sanctioned company. So it's pretty much complex. But looking at especially the ESG risk, so environmental, social, and governance risk, we have in this moment globally a huge lack of ESG information. So companies that are obliged to disclose such data, KPIs and so on, are pretty much few. We are speaking about more or less 150,000 companies worldwide. So is nothing. Okay. So this is a huge challenge that regulators are trying to address, for example, with the EU taxonomy. But for sure, so trying to answer your question, we need different kind of data, and also adverse media obviously plays a huge role, because at the end is very important to understand if even if a company, for example, is not on a sanction list, if there is something, if there is maybe a possibility that this company is going to land in one of these lists, and adverse media obviously gives a huge support in this direction.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was more also thinking on the more practical level when we talk about data, and we would like to see if the partnership with a supplier is up and running. So it's not about the onboarding and all that stuff and contracting. It's about when we lift the partnership and transaction and money is flowing between both partners. Then we see that sometimes we don't get the right detail data that is required to get red flags, whether there is a potential bribery alert or a potential corruption alert, and so on. So for providing those red flags, sometimes the data is not really sufficient in terms of the detailed level that we would like to see from the ERP system, whether it's SAP, whether it's Microsoft Dynamics or another system. So from a practical perspective, that's an issue, and that's for me some sort of data transparency as well. But now maybe you would like to continue. So sorry for interrupting you.
No, this is a very interesting topic. And actually, we know how, for example, our clients, especially from the banking space, they are really trying a new solution to build this what we call like a perpetual KYC or KYS solution, no? Where you can really in a real time almost also update the data that you have, for example, in your client data solution, no? And this is a very interesting point, because at the end you should be able really to have additional triggers, no, really to understand if the profile that you, for example, initially assessed as medium risk, low risk, maybe is evolving into another risk dimension, no? So this really understand from a holistic perspective that your risk have a evolution, obviously, no? But this is a very interesting topic. I think that we can go a bit deeper than also in the next points, speaking about the German Supply Chain Act. Yeah, maybe just to briefly wrap up the points that maybe are relevant for in the next months, you know, as outlook from a compliance perspective. I would just name another couple of points that is, for example, corporate liability. This is another very interesting aspect. And we have, in this regard, good examples, you know, from the UK Bribery Act and the current sixth AMLD. So especially the UK Bribery Act was one of the first law in 2010, if I well remember, where this aspect played an important role. Nowadays is the sixth AMLD forerunner in this regard. And then looking at always this corporate responsibility, we have the topic cooperation, a very important aspect. So benefit from a greater transparency on expectation of cooperation. So it means that many countries, many regimes motivate a company under investigation to cooperate with the authorities in order to avoid corporate conviction and have a discounted fine. The point is, and this is very important, is the corporate appetite for cooperation will depend on the benefits now that they could have. And this is pretty much interesting also in this case to look at what is happening in UK, for example, no, with DPA, so Deferred Prosecution Agreement. So I mean, there are companies that are trying to go in this direction, but it's not always a very easy way. So a bit more clarity also from the regulator's perspective would be welcomed, actually.
I guess I guess a good example is here, not only if you look directly to the regulators, but also World Bank has a debarment list ready, and I guess I shared on LinkedIn the last debarment that they sent towards an advisory company in Africa. So they already had a sort of cooperation agreement, and that's why they could have limited the penalties, and especially in this case, the time frame of the debarment. And that's if you look on revenue stream, that's obviously a very important topic for a company. Yeah. So absolutely agree on that one.
Yeah, I cannot comment too much because I cannot speak about customers. But yeah, for sure, this is a very good example. And actually, last year we had a couple of interesting example of a really huge corporate, so global corporate that had this kind of procedures. Maybe just to touch upon another couple of topics. So supply chain also is a very hot topic nowadays, and we are seeing that many different legislations, many different countries are now having in place a law in this regard. The last one is in Germany. That is pretty much broader as a really also as a implementation. And then also AML and CTF regimes. So I mean, we saw during the last years different new AML directives, the fourth one, the fifth one, the sixth one, And we saw also many more countries introducing or updating AML laws, even where I mean historically these countries had weak AML control. So was pretty much
So Enrico,
interesting point.
Enrico, which countries do you especially see? I mean, obviously we are located in Germany, so we see that law coming this year. So how did the other countries evolve? You know, which countries are more developed? What other countries are supposed to develop in short
But
time?
we have in 2022 a couple of news. For example, there is the new AML law in Switzerland, where there will be more focus on beneficial owner data, more focus on update this data. So this was the initial point with Dirk, how you can really update your client data. In this case, looking at AML risk. And then also covering other additional aspects like transaction monitoring, for example. A very interesting aspect to grow, to understand if your current profiles are updated is so in a continuous way, so match the information coming from transaction monitoring and your KYC profiles, for example. This is another interesting point. But generally speaking, I would say that I mean in Europe we have the sixth AMLD that is pretty much a good also law. Maybe it's still a bit behind if we look at AML like all crime with an all crime approach, because in this case we have just 22 predicate offenses, but is already a very interesting I mean implementation. Maybe in the next future we'll have also, I think, if not next year, in a couple of years, also the seventh anti-money laundering directive in Europe. So I think we have really a lot of updates in this regard.
Yeah,
I guess
okay.
the cycles are always shortened, so it's from the first to the second to the third directive. Was much more time the regulator gave the markets to adopt, whereas now it's coming nearly on an annual basis.
But the fourth one was 2017. So and in 2020 we had two. So in January the fifth and in December the sixth. So I mean, it's something that is really speeding up, but there is also important signals. I mean, when we look at AML, actually, we see also a huge problem in the relationship between, for example, obliged entities that can be financial institutions, for example, and these FIUs, so the financial intelligence units, because the risk-based approach that they have banks, for example, is a bit different now in comparison to the risk-based approach that have FIUs. And the point is that the banks, in many situations, to protect themselves, they try to send these special activity reports in many situations where are, from a AML perspective, defensive special activity report. So where maybe there is sometimes a bit lack of information. If we take into consideration the cryptocurrencies world, where is really in the beginning, and this is a huge problem for banks. And obviously FIUs are not able to to be very efficient in this.
But the AML regulation is also, I would not like to focus only on financial service industries. I would also see the non-financials, whether it's from the FATF called the designated non-financial business and professions, but also let's say manufacturing companies are affected by the AML directive the same way. So the way they have to handle it is a little bit different. For good sake, for the non-financial services, but it's they still have to cover it. And from my perspective, and I'm not sure whether you see it the same way, there is a connectivity or an interconnection between anti-bribery and corruption on the one side, and money laundering on the other side. So if you bribe someone, or if you are let's say if you have some corruption issues and they don't catch you for that, at least they will catch you for some AML topics. So you always have to see what kind of dependencies you have between the regulations, which what doesn't make it easier for the companies, by the way. So you always have to build your own risk assessment, and you have to see, okay, what kind of legislation and laws do I have to consider, by what kind of product, in what kind of geography, and so on and so on, and to get your net risk out of your activities.
Yeah, and I mean, if I look into some cases where in the past the AML law was not strong enough to sanction somebody, they used the tax law. And if tax didn't work out, because if you laundered money or if you bribed, there's always loss in taxes. So,
Al
but in the
Capone
meantime,
was not guilty by as being a murderer.
exactly,
He
that's
was,
the best. That's the best example. But what
so,
I can see in the meantime is that I have the impression that AML laws or anti-bribery laws, they get stricter and stricter, so that the tax evasion stuff sort of runs beside. And what you just mentioned, Dirk, I mean, I think it's correct that maybe there's also a lot of conflicting laws. If I think of data privacy and the AML, which was the case with the money laundering directive. So I think there's a lot of conflicting laws, but what I also see is that the AML laws, I think, get stricter and stricter and closer, and it gets more and more confusing. So the compliance officer in the corporation is not only looking at AML laws, but also about data privacy, also info security for sure, and others.
Yeah.
But as you mentioned, tax. So I guess I'm not sure whether this is valid all over Europe, for example. But if I look on our experience in Germany, so most of the anti-bribery and corruption cases are issued by tax auditors. So if they come from tax authority just to audit your books, and you are not fast enough to answer some of their questions, and they see they will raise an anti-bribery and corruption investigation. So that's indeed in Germany at least a starting point for most of them. If it's not coming through some US regulators, because you have let's say some failures against the FCPA, or as Enrico already mentioned, against the UK Bribery Act, because both are so-called exterritorial regulations.
But
maybe Enrico, can you elaborate what does it mean, this exterritorial stuff?
Maybe. No, just I wanted to echo also a point about this the fraud firstly, because actually what you mentioned, that these criminal proceeds, for example, regarding fraud, has to be laundered in some ways. And this is the reason why, for sure, there is a very strong connection between money laundering and fraud and other kind of criminal activities. The point is, and this is the direction that this 6AML and then 6AML and then also the 7th will be even more strict in this regard, is this really all crime approach, that every possible crime that is creating a sort of proceeding, economical proceedings, should be also investigated with a AML lens. And this is important also if we look at, for example, the topic adverse media. How adverse media can be deployed in this regard. If we, for example, in Germany, we have these 22 predicate of offenses. Now for AML, it's very interesting to understand how you can match this 22 predicate offense to modern adverse media tool. And this is what, for example, we do at Moody's with our adverse media tool. So this is a very important aspect where you can put together effectiveness, so in terms of really looking at the risk that for you are relevant, and efficiency, also a false positive reduction. So it's really trying to focus your resource that for definition are limited, obviously, as a company, in the right direction. So this is very, very important.
Yeah.
About please, sorry.
Yeah,
It's
like
just because your last topic on your on your trends for 2022 was, I guess, navigating conflicting laws driven by geopolitics. I guess that's where I think some of the problems are occurring. It's not only that you have different regulations within one country, but it's getting more stressful if you have to cover on multiple geographies the specific regulations as well.
Absolutely. Sorry.
So, and what I also would like to stress, if we talk about this in context to supply chain, I think one of the trends, and that's maybe an intersection of some of your topics here, is also about resilience, supply chain resilience. You can use a very tough supply chain compliance as an early warning towards your supply chain resilience management approach.
Yeah.
So it's that's one I guess an important topic that is always out of discussion. It's all about it's getting too complex. It's getting it's too costly and so on. But seeing it as a chance and as a part of supply chain resilience, I guess, is a very important topic here as well.
Yeah. I don't know, Jürgen, if you wanted to
yeah,
add something.
I actually wanted to stick a little bit before we go into the supply chain. I wanted to talk a little bit about how companies actually struggle to police themselves, and hence governments are implementing more stringent regulatory requirements and that. So that's one of the topics that we were told is of interest. So maybe you can give us like your best thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very old topic. We saw this many times. I mean, for example, the last time that we saw this topic was 2007, 2008, before the financial crisis. I mean, in this case, looking at, for example, the Supply Chain Act in Germany, it's an interesting case because just in a nutshell, maybe just a bit background in this regard. The German government started to draft an action plan in 2016. An action plan that had to take into consideration, moreover, this UN guiding principle for business and human rights. In the very beginning, the idea was try to push a bit friendly, push companies to comply with these requirements in order to obviously improve transparency and so on in their supply chain. So the first implementation was absolutely voluntary. So was a voluntary commitment by these companies in Germany. Wasn't a law. The problem was that after two surveys, one in 2019 and the second one in 2020, we saw that really a tiny percentage of these companies were fully compliant with these requirements. And this was a bit also the trigger for the government to say, okay, so maybe now we should move to the next step, that is done this Supply Chain Act that will come into law in 1 year in 2023, at least for the companies with more than 3,000 employees. And then 2024 for companies with more than 1,000 employees. So it's this is a bit the interesting point about really police themselves. It's difficult because as a company you have to set priorities, and maybe in the beginning wasn't this the first priority. No.
Yeah, and I think it's very different from country to country. How stringent are the regulations and how quickly these evolve. So Dirk, what is your experience, out of a professional services perspective? I mean, I think you have seen like 100 countries or so with regulations. What is your experience here? So which are the hot topics, or how quickly do they sometimes evolve?
That can be quite fast, and I guess there are a lot of good examples already out there and went public. At least that's where the reputational damage is coming from, besides all the other financial pains. But coming back to what Enrico mentioned before, so there you have an advantage on the supply chain side that the category managers, so the purchase department, are very well educated on compliance typically. At least for the bigger companies, that's valid. So they have a very good view on what they need to check on a potential supplier. And now it's getting a little bit more that they have to do. A little bit is please put in brackets, but there is, from a supply chain perspective, I guess, a very well educated part of the staff already in there that is supporting the compliance department with a good understanding about what needs to be done. If you look on the whole bribery and corruption practice, your, let's say, big issue is more on the demand side. So if you look on your sales channels, as more channels as you have in more countries you're working, as more problems you're getting on being compliant, because those people, sales is typically not educated on compliance. They get, as always, information about data protection. They get information about workspace security and all that stuff, but they typically don't get really an education about compliance. So that's the first topic. So if you don't get your first line in place, you're struggling with the other defense lines. And the big topic is also, despite all the different regulations in all those different countries, you always have to look for a consistent approach that is valid for your whole company. So there is no one size fits all. Every company has to find its own way. But a supplier that needs to be onboarded in Germany needs to go through at least the same risk assessment as he needs to go when he is, let's say, approaching the same company, but also only in Singapore or in South Africa or wherever, which makes it easier from an overall governance perspective. But if you look for a group policy approach, a group governance approach, and then you drill it down to each entity and then to each country, you see the variety and the adoptions you need to do to this approach to also be compliant to the local regulation. And there is a quite good source from the UN. It's the TRACE database. I guess the TRACE database is covering roughly about 170 different bribery and corruption regulations all over the world. So by each country, you can see what kind of specific regulation I have to look for. That helps, but I guess the big challenge is how to bring this to one consistent approach for each of the companies. And especially if we talk about supply chain, that's only the supply chain, as it's called. And for some of the so if you have to handle with I don't know, with dual use goods and so on, you were already known that you need to cover the whole supply chain.
So Dirk, maybe we can go a little bit deeper into the supply chain, because there's actually also a question in the comments. But let me kick off with that one. How smaller companies can handle a supply chain in ESG due diligence process. So what would you give them as a good advice, so that even these companies can handle it, and how they can familiarize themselves with the regulations?
I guess don't panic. So it's the same if you go along the street and you see a dog coming after you. Don't panic. If you panic, you're lost. He's faster, and at least it's ugly if he bites you. It's the same for compliance on the supply chain. The good thing about that is, see, even the regulator accepts that with this there is not one size fits all approach. He says that, so the topic behind that is also that a small company of course has not the same ability, not the same resources to do the same stuff as a big company needs to do. So there is an acceptance on the regulator side that of course you cannot be 100% compliance here. You have to show that your willingness, you have to show your program, you have to show a governance, you have to show your tone from the top. As Enrico mentioned, the culture is also a topic, but you always have to take care. It's not about talking about culture, it's about living the culture within your company. For example, so one topic is always the right to audit your supplier. So for that was I guess 5 years ago or 10 years ago, that was that hype topic for medium to high risk suppliers. I need to have the right to audit them. So then there are regulator made this quite clear, at least the one in the US, that if you have these audit rights, you have at least to do sample testings, and you have to prove that you do it. If you don't do it, hey, it's an alibi function. So it's not, you may talk about it, but you don't live it. So be careful with those policies and regulations.
Yeah, I think that the questions from one of our viewers fits quite well into that. Do you think Supply Chain Act will make greenwashing more difficult? In what way? I mean, it's basically what you were saying. The first step was having the right to audit the suppliers. But I mean, greenwashing is still going on. So how can that be done more effectively, and do the current acts in the different parts of the world help avoiding that?
You need for sure two things. First of all, you need the right data. This was also the point from Dirk. The point is that the right data in the ESG, I would say area is difficult to find. We don't have it actually on the market, no. And the second point is really this also the due diligence process that you have in place. Now, a due diligence process where you just you don't just look at your own business, but also you take into consideration your suppliers. So for example, direct suppliers, tier 1 suppliers, even tier 2 suppliers. And this is the point why, for example, this law could impact also smaller companies. No, because at the end, I mean, a big company, I would say, no, is directly impacted, but maybe a smaller one is a part of a supply chain of a bigger one, and then for this, in this regard, is more or less obliged to fulfill also such requirements. Otherwise, maybe would lose the business in this regard. But I think that also looking at the greenwashing aspect is a very there is a point that is very relevant. Is the risk-based approach. Is I mean facing risk is an essential part of a business. The point is to really understand if they are aligned with the company risk appetite, and also greenwashing should be looked in this regard. And to understand if so this kind of risk, the initial risk analysis for a company is essential step. So this exercise should be run at least yearly. And every time that there is a substantial change affecting, for example, the risk profile, I don't know, new business lines or the operation in new high-risk countries. And but the very important point in this regard, and this is again the culture aspect that also Dirk mentioned, is that at the end you should have like a risk map, a map where you present your risk according to, for example, business area, location, products, and so on, to really understand which kind of impact and likelihood can have those risks.
Yeah, I mean, what you're basically saying is that there's a couple of layers that you need to put that you need to overlay, and only if all the layers fail more or less, then you have failed something in your chain of supply chain of testing and looking at the data. So,
Yeah, so
the
if you,
risk map, the risk map, I think, is an important thing, especially if you're not producing only in one country, but if you're producing in multiple countries, and the other countries may have a different risk perspective on the supply chain, even it's the same countries, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But this was the point about companies across different regions, that have to fulfill also a lot of different and not homogeneous regulations. How you can be compliant but also efficient, because at the end, if you really comply with all these laws, regulatory requirements, is very complex, and there is also maybe not efficient. It's effective because you are compliant, but it's not efficient. And you have to think that when you build a process, when you build a framework, then you have also to maintain it. As I said, at yearly basis, or every time that something from a risk perspective happens, new products, new business line, everything you want, you should be able also to look at your approach and understand if you have to change something. So it's also this a very important point, especially relevant if you are working across multiple regions.
and of course, you can also implement some controls against greenwashing, as you mentioned. So that's also possible. If you have a risk assessment done for your risk-based approach, you can also take care about your controls, and you can implement controls for green washing as well. Yeah. And I guess to finalize this topic about how big the effort for smaller companies is and how they are affected. So first of all, they are affected, definitely, whether it's in full or in part, doesn't matter. They have to take care about it. So that's a clear recommendation. But the good thing is, it's based on their business and the business risk, so it's affordable.
Yeah. So we basically, what we just said is basically it's an holistic risk-based approach that we need to follow, and it doesn't need to be, it's not rocket science, and it has to be adequate to the size of the company actually. So from the experience, Enrico, that you shared, and Dirk, it's a quickly evolving subject as well. So you have to basically also review your approach each and every year. And what I want to come to the next point is, during the pandemic that we experienced the past 2 years or so, we have the impression that basically this unfortunate situation has improved the company's knowledge about their own supply chain. and also gave them an opportunity, to apply a more holistic risk approach. So could you echo that? So what is your impression and your market view on that?
Absolutely, absolutely. So for sure, Corona changed how companies deal with their supply chain. So this is a matter of fact. The last 2 years, many organizations face huge demand fluctuations, for example, and several logistic constraints. I don't know, suppliers have reduced or stopped their operation, Corona restriction, and so on and so forth. And all these aspects brought the companies to deepen their supply chain understanding and increase as a first reaction, the number of suppliers that they have as option. And this was the point was they wanted to save their operations at the end, because without suppliers they couldn't deliver, they couldn't provide their products. But this means also an increasing number of due diligence, for example, to be run more or less in the same time. So to achieve that, they must speed up the due diligence process, and this was a matter of fact, but without having in place update solutions in terms of data and technology, it means also face new risk. So this was the huge problem. So new risk that you are not able to recognize and mitigate with the right measures. So this is also the point about the risk-based approach. So this is the reason why Corona triggered also more awareness about these compliance and reputational issues. And many companies are now reshaping their risk-based approach, trying to enhance the trade-off between effectiveness. So are you really looking at the right risk and efficiency? So the related due diligence effort, because you have to run more due diligence in the less time, in the same time. And in the end, when we look at the compliance requirements, it's really becoming more than just a tick box approach in this regard. Now, it's really relevant how organizations embed those in their processes. And this is not something that is just technologies, is not just data, but it's also, and moreover, in many situations, culture, really training for people, controls that have to be put in place, and so on and so forth. So it's but Corona for sure was also a very important, point now to teach us how such processes, procedures should have been improved, actually. I don't know if I answered your point.
Yeah, I think that it did. So my impression is also that company also took the time during this pandemic because the global supply chain struggled more or less, that they worked because many production sites shut down. So what is the risk besides that? Anti-bribery and corruption pieces. Also, like, can it be produced in this country? Only do I need to find other suppliers in regions that are not affected by the pandemic or not that much affected, which has nothing to do actually with ESG in the first step, but it has to do with my whole supply chain management that I have to put. So that also again shows that compliance is not working completely isolated and siloed, but it also has to work here together with the production side, with supply chain management, with procurement inside the company.
I may maybe need to bring a different opportunity here on the table. So I think, Corona time did a lot in terms of supply chain resilience. As we all are aware about how unstable those supply chains were so far, and how big the efforts are now to bring more to stabilize them or to change them in total, and do some more nearshoring instead of offshoring, for example. But in terms of compliance, I think that was not changing, was not the game changer. Of course, due to the resilience, as I mentioned, the companies bring more data into the company. They're using different kind of technologies to get earlier warnings about environmental changes and all that stuff that can be used for compliance as well. No matter about that. But that was no boost on the compliance. I guess from a compliance perspective, the boost was what happens in China, where the ESG principles from the UN Global Compact were coming in the game, where more awareness at all is on ESG at all. I guess that was changing also the compliance side. On supply chain compliance. So it wasn't COVID-19 from my perspective. It's more what happened in the world about slavery, child work, overall labor conditions, and so on. And all those scandals that we saw in the press coming up and so on, that changed more on the compliance side as COVID-19.
Yeah. So I've just got another question. Sorry for interrupting. There's quite some questions. So I want to pick out this one here. So can companies benefit from transparent supply chains? And is there maybe even a return of investment from transparency and sustainability? Are there any good company examples here?
I know that some especially in food compliance. So that's if we look, we focus on supply chain compliance so far, coming more from a regulatory anti-bribery and corruption and supply chain act perspective. But within the supply chain, you have also product compliance issues, and if you look on the food business and the supply chain you have for those many companies that are in the food industry, it's very important for them to measure quality and compliance directly at their tier 1 suppliers, or even on the suppliers before their tier 1 suppliers. So across the whole chain. And I know that there are multiple investments are now ongoing on a global scale to get more sensors out there, to collect more data, to use different information from GPS, from satellites, and so on, to get more data points and to get more controls that can also be used for compliance. So there's definitely a benefit in being more transparent, but you can only be more transparent if you have more data and more controls in place, and that's affecting data protection, of course, and data protection laws on the other side. But there's a lot of initiatives going on there, which are, let's say, accompanying or supporting what we are discussing here in terms of supply chain compliance.
I would just to add a small piece from my side. I would say transparency obviously is a very important point in compliance, and for sure, if you achieve more transparency, means that you also have more visibility of your risk, and you can also having this in place, you can also understand which kind of measures you can implement to mitigate those. And this is obviously also a very important point for your business model. No, a business model that has this kind of clarity and transparency means that is also more, I would say, sustainable, and sustainability from a business perspective. I would say that a field, without naming any company, that a field where we can see this in this very moment, is the oil and gas industry, for example, between Russia, Germany, and so on, where we are seeing that there is an increase of activities of improvement, I would say, for their compliance operation. It is pretty much interesting.
Okay, thanks for answering this question. So for those who have more questions and we couldn't answer all of them, you can also directly contact us. The speakers today, just go on the LinkedIn profile. They're on the LinkedIn live session, so you can directly ask Dirk, Enrico, or myself if you want to deep dive a bit more. You can also ask questions in the chat. And before we come to the last point that I would like to discuss with Enrico and Dirk, I want also to mention, please subscribe to our channel so that you get the latest out of it. And at the end, I will announce the next date when we will be live again. So coming to the last point, it's basically more about possible implementation approaches and combining data and technology. So how to build this robust framework that everybody is talking about. Also, also embed these always changing regulation requirements, and how can I do the due diligence process, and from a prescriptive to a holistic manner.
Yeah, I mean, looking at, in this case, at the Supply Chain Act, you have a couple of moments that you have to take into consideration. No? You have to go through to build this comprehensive approach. So as I mentioned before, first of all, a risk assessment. So really understand which kind of risk you are facing in this moment. Also, maybe looking at those in a sort of a gap analysis, between the current situation and the target picture, target picture where you'll take also into consideration this new risk. And then understand with a risk analysis which kind of impact and the likelihood really have those risks in your on your business model, on your company, and in this regard, this supply chain law is a bit a step forward, because you cannot just take into consideration your own business, but also your suppliers. And in some situations where you have also direct control, maybe also the suppliers, your supplier, that is even more complicated. We are speaking about KYSS, so know your supplier, and not know your supplier. So it's a bit more complicated. But for sure, as you mentioned, in this, yeah, it's like a joke. But for sure, in this dimension is very interesting. Understand which kind of role have also your measures, like due diligence, for example. And due diligence is not just about data, it's not just about the right technology, but it's also really understand in which regard has to be embedded in your processes, when you have to trigger, for example, a simple due diligence, when I enhance due diligence, when you should maybe pay a visit, to a customer, to a supplier, and so on, to really to gather also more information. So and their technology can really be supportive with, for example, also adverse media, really gathering information that can give you like a new also hint, about this possible risk evolution. And just to maybe to conclude very briefly, a very important aspect in this law, but also in this approach, is also a complaint management. So people in your company, but also people that work in your supply chain, should be able also to access a complaint management. That is a very important aspect in order that the company is aware of maybe possible human rights infringements or other compliance infringement in this case, and also in this case, data protection and so on plays a role, especially for companies that are across different jurisdictions. And yeah. And then just the last point is the reporting, external reporting from a regulatory perspective, but also internal reporting, to understand if the measures that you implemented are really achieving the expected result, and otherwise you should maybe, amend those and make some changes. So this is about, a couple of in a couple of minutes, what I would suggest to start.
Yeah, so we're coming to the end of our live stream. Dirk, do you want to give a comment on this as well, and then I would conclude the session for today.
Maybe a short one in regards to best practices. So it's if you drive a supply chain compliance program by or through your compliance department without getting the stakeholders, meaning your supplier managers, your purchase department, and so on, along with you, don't do it. So always start with the business partner, with the stakeholder inside of your company, or from a compliance perspective. Get business as part of your as your stakeholder and support them in building a supply chain compliance. Don't do it the other way around. Don't do it as a starting point out of compliance. Start with the business pain. That's definitely a best practice recommendation that I can give here.
That was great, famous last words. I really appreciate. So today we covered quite some topics in the whole supply chain ESG thing. So we talked about the regulatory overview. You know, what are the frameworks that are currently up there? We talked about the whole due diligence process. We talked about best practices, and at the end we talked about how to implement such approaches. You know, using data and technology. So thanks a lot to Enrico and Dirk for the session today. Really appreciated that. It was very interesting. So for the viewers, thanks for your interest. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us. There's a couple of ways to do so. You can either follow us on LinkedIn, where we will announce the next live event. You can also follow us on YouTube. Or you can subscribe to our blogs on our website. And I'm really looking forward to the next expert talk. For today, we're done. I'm quite sure, and I foresee the next year we will have another session on supply chain, because that's an evolving story and it's developing faster than we could say. So thanks for everybody, and leave your comments down there. And looking forward to see you very soon, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.